So welcome everyone. I'm Kirsten Cappy. Some of you know me from I'm Your Neighbor Books. Some of you know me from Curious City. Some of you I'm meeting for the very first time, which is very exciting. I asked Stephanie to change our agenda, to hand me the mic before we got started. I just wanted to acknowledge where we might all be at this moment. We have suffered 2 mass shootings in less than a week, in less than 2 weeks. And I think we're all feeling a bit shocked, angry, and heartbroken, maybe not in that order. I keep screwing up that order keeps changing for me. And you might have heard the news late today that the Colorado shooter migrated to this country as a child from Syria. I think we all know that for many people, this man's identity will be linked to his violence, but we also know that that's a racist response. If it were not racist, then we'd be blaming white men for the majority of mass shootings in this country. And I just wanted to take a minute to commend you for being here tonight to talk about young people and the literature that shapes them. And I want to commend you for using books to deepen our understanding of ourselves and of each other. I think being here tonight is part of you raising your voice against violence and against racism. And I think finally, I want to say that the remainder of the school year may be hard for our Asian American students and for our Muslim American students. They're all victims of this country's sometimes narrow definition of what culture is. So, and in a way, I think they're victims of these shootings. So I hope we're going to give you some strategies tonight to broaden those cultural definitions and to celebrate this diverse America. So I just all wanted us to take sort of a deep breath and get ready to celebrate the beautiful writing and contributions of Hena Kahn. So Hena, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you, Kirsten, for those amazing words. One of our earliest, if not our first ever event at Print was with Kirsten and I'm Your Neighbor Books, where she did a presentation on children's books focused on new arrival stories. And that talk and her support over the past 4 years, has truly shaped every decision that I make when choosing what books to stock at the store and what events that we're bringing to our community. I'm always honored to be celebrating children's literature through these events, but I don't think the other events we hosted will feel slighted if I say that tonight is truly something special. I'm very glad to be part of it. Now, I have the less fun businessy side of things to talk about before we get into the real heart of tonight. So good evening, everyone. And thank you for joining us to celebrate Hena Kahn's novel, AMINA'S Song, co-hosted by Kirsten Cappy of I'm Your Neighbor Books and Louise El Yaafouri of Diversifi-ED. I've been eagerly looking forward to this evening and to learning more about incorporating Muslim literature in classrooms and the resources available through I'm Your Neighbor Books. Just as a reminder to everyone, our panelists will be answering questions after the presentation. If you look to the bottom of your screens, you will see a Q&A function. There you can submit your questions. If you are watching from the Facebook Live, you can comment your questions there and I will see them there as well. We also have copies of AMINA'S Song available for sale on our website. I'm going to drop a link right now into the chat where people can get their own copies, and we do have signed book plates available as well. And now, without any further ado, it is my honor to introduce our panelists for this evening. Louise El Yaafouri is a recent arriver and cultural competency consultant in Diversifi-ED consulting. She provides professional development and curriculum design in areas of emergent lingual education, trauma-informed practice, culturally responsive pedagogy, and equity inclusion work. Louise has authored a wide range of ed-related books and magazine articles. Louise has served as newcomer educator, Rodel exemplary educator, Mile High teacher, and professional Fulbright educator to Tanzania, where she founded a school that continues to graduate students each year. She has also served a global as a global mentor to teachers in Kenya's Kakuma and Dadaab refugee camps in partnership with Columbia University. Currently, she holds board positions at the United Nations Association Denver and New America Schools, and maintains vital partnerships with local and international refugee-serving entities. Louise lives between Denver, Colorado, and Said, Lebanon, with her husband and sons, Noor and Jude. Kirsten Cappy is the co-founder and executive director of I'm Your Neighbor Books, a nonprofit that creates welcoming spaces for new arrivals and new Americans using children's literature. The project brings books and communities together for conversations on who belongs in this diverse America. They've just been recognized by the Association of American School Libraries for their traveling welcoming libraries, a pop-up community conversation on immigration, welcoming, and belonging using picture books. Parallel to this work, Kirsten operates Curious City DPW, a project that offers free programming, classroom guides, and book giveaways to schools and libraries nationwide. Kirsten lives in Portland, Maine, where she blissfully shares a neighborhood with Print, a bookstore. Hena Kahn is a Pakistani-American writer. She's the author of the award-winning middle-grade novel, AMINA'S VOICE, and the follow-up, AMINA'S SONG, which received a starred review from SGL. They called this novel a lovely sequel, an uplifting story about relationships, especially those that strengthen us and help us grow, a beautiful story for middle graders discovering who they are. Also, with the Salam Reads imprint at Simon & Schuster, Hena has published the Little Women-inspired More to the Story and the Zaid Salim Chasing the Dream basketball series. Her picture books include Golden Domes and Silver Lanterns, Crescent Moons and Pointed Minarets, Like the Moon Loves the Sky, and others. Hena lives in her hometown of Rockville, Maryland, with her family. And without further ado, I will pass it on to our panelists.
And I'd like to introduce Pius Ali, who's going to join us later in the conversation, but is here. He'll be in and out, and I think he will bridge these conversations beautifully. Pius is so many things, but I will say first that he is a Portland, Maine city councilman and the director of Portland Empowered, which is an amazing organization that ensures that the voices of immigrant and BIPOC students and parents are reflected in our public school policies and practice. Pius is an immigrant from the beautiful Ghana and the co-president of I'm Your Neighbor Books. Thanks for joining us, Pius.
Thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I'm gonna turn off my camera and just listen, and then I will join you later.
Right.
Is that the plan?
That's a perfect plan.
Okay, thank you.
So Hena, we will turn it over to you for a bit.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Kristen, for putting this together. Thank you, Print Bookstore, Stephanie, Louise, Pius, everyone who worked hard to make this event happen. I'm such a big fan of what you do, Kristen, and I'm really honored that you invited me to talk with everyone tonight. I guess the stories I tell really are about belonging and about what it means to be American in many ways. And as someone who grew up as the child of immigrants from Pakistan, I was born and raised in Maryland, which is where I still live now, where I'm talking to you from. You know, I grew up with that sense of not quite fitting in fully, but wanting to, like so many kids. And those are some of the themes that I like to explore in my writing. At the same time, as someone who never saw herself in books, right? I was an avid reader. I was a library goer. I was one of those kids who really turned to story for entertainment, for comfort, for research. You know, I loved reading about other families and how they lived as compared to my own family. I think like many children of immigrants, I was searching for answers a lot of the time. And you know, I knew that my life was maybe a little bit different than my peers. And so it was sort of like a window for me to read about other people's lives and what their families look like. And, you know, even as an avid reader, I never saw myself in stories. And I know now as an adult, what an impact that made on me, even though I wasn't conscious of it when I was a child. You know, I just sort of internalized the idea that my story didn't matter or was somehow less important because I never saw it. I'm someone who was a writer as a kid too. I wrote for fun. I wrote plays and poems in a family newspaper, but I never wrote about my personal experiences. I never wrote about my culture. Even my own family newspaper was devoid of the culture that was around me every day, which to me is really telling about how important, representation is to build confidence, to, for children to feel seen and to be included, and just as important, to feel like others are seeing them as the center of stories where they matter, where their experiences count. And so I'm so honored to be able to write stories that, do center Muslim American, Pakistani American characters like me. Amina's Voice was the very first middle grade. I wrote picture books, and I still write picture books and chapter books. Amina's Voice was the first middle grade novel that I published back in 2017. And it also launched the Salam Reads imprint of Simon & Schuster, which was amazing. And we'll probably talk about that more later. But for me, Amina's Voice was very much a story that I would have loved to have read as a child. A story of family and community and friendship. Fundamentally, it's a friendship story. And it sort of grew out of my personal experience going to my public school, growing, in my hometown, and having a Korean American best friend who, like me, had a name that wasn't always easy for everyone else to pronounce. But my best friend talked about changing her name when her family was going to be naturalized. And that sort of sparked the idea of a girl who's experiencing something similar. And that was Amina's friend Soo Jin in Amina's Voice is thinking of that same thing. But Amina, like me, is a child of immigrants, trying to balance two cultures, growing up in contemporary Wisconsin, actually in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is where my husband was raised. But unlike me, Amina has this beautiful gift, this amazing singing voice and musical talent that she's afraid to let shine. And in the first book, as she's navigating changes in middle school and her friendships, she has to find the courage to share her voice and actually use her voice to help bring her community together in a time of tragedy. The Islamic Center, that it's a little bit of a spoiler, but it's kind of known. So I'll share that the Islamic Center that her family is a big part of is under attack. And so she, responds to that terrible occurrence. In Amina's Song, the sequel, which just launched I guess 2 weeks ago today, maybe, or yesterday. What are days anymore, right? Really recently, this book just came out, and it was really wonderful for me to be able to go back and revisit Amina's story, to pick up where Amina's Voice ended, where we got to see her grow into herself and, find more confidence and really, mature in some ways. And we get to see her evolve further in this book. What was exciting for me was to take her to Pakistan, because in Amina's Voice, her uncle comes to visit her family. And that's a big, that also came from my own personal experience, having my uncle come visit my family when I was a child, and remembering how much of an impact that had on our home, and how much my parents were trying to impress him and make sure everything was perfect. And then realizing that, I didn't know how to speak to him in Urdu fluently, and that made me uncomfortable. And I wasn't always sure if he was approving of us, and the way we went about our lives. And over time, I realized that we just needed to understand each other, and we did develop a very sweet bond. And Amina similarly gets to know her uncle even better in Amina's Song when she visits him in Pakistan. And like so many children who finally get to visit the country of their origin, or their parents' home country. And much like it was for me when I was growing up, it was such an overwhelming experience, in the best way, where I was not only surrounded by love from relatives who I hadn't seen in a very long time, and really connected with, but also, to be surrounded by people who look like you is sort of, it's very different when you're not used to that. And to just be immersed in a different culture, to see the beauty of a place that you don't know very well, can really be transformative. And that's what Amina experiences when she goes there. She falls in love with it, even if she doesn't always know how to, speak the language fluently or negotiate at markets or, figure out how traffic works. She just loves this place. And when she returns home, she's determined to keep a promise to her uncle to share the beauty of Pakistan with her peers. But she realizes it's a lot harder than she thought. Because not only do people have limited attention spans, but they also have preconceived notions of what Pakistan is. And when she decides to do a school presentation on Malala, a hero who is an advocate for girls' education and the youngest person to ever win the Nobel Peace Prize, it sort of backfires. And she realizes that people in her class are picking up on only the worst parts of the story. And so she has to figure out ways to open up people's minds and let them see more than the single story, as we talk about. They're viewing through a very particular lens the country that she loves, and she wants them to understand it better. So the story still continues Amina's journey with music and her friendships. She makes a new friend who's a boy named Nico that causes some ripples in her family, and everyone's eyebrows go up. They want to know what's going on with her and this boy. She has to figure that out for herself as she's trying to figure out how to pursue her new interest in producing music and, really expressing herself through song. So that's the gist of Amina's song. But I thought I'd read a chapter from the book that takes place when she's still in Pakistan, and she's hanging out with her cousin Zora, who she's bonded with very much on this trip. And they're lying on the roof at night. Ooh, that smells so good, I inhale deeply. Raat ki Rani, Zora says from the charpai she's sprawled across on the rooftop terrace. It's called Queen of the Night since it blooms after dark. Even 2 stories above the garden, the fragrance fills the air around us. It's late, after 10 o'clock, and everything is quieting down for the night. I hear less honking in the distance, and fewer lights interfere with the stars. One of the stray cats that Zora feeds is curled up on the roof near the leg of my charpai, asleep, but I'm not sleepy at all. Zora and I are settling in for our nightly chat. I love the scent. I want to plant some in Greendale, but I wonder if it would survive in the winter, I say. Doubt it. It likes hot weather. I wonder if I would survive your winter, but I want to see the snow, Zora replies. She drops the shells of the pistachios she's eating into a metal bowl. You should come visit us in the winter. I sit up at the idea of Zora in my hometown and the chance to show her what our lives are like in America. I could introduce her to Rabia, Sujin, and Emily, who I know will adore her. And Zora would love checking out the museums and the mall and all the Christmas decorations and lights. Maybe, I don't know. Zora sounds surprisingly uninterested. You and Ahmed should come together, I press. Isn't he almost 20? You're old enough to travel alone. He has a second year of medical school starting in September, and I have school too. I don't think we can. You have winter break, don't you? Yes, Zora pauses, but we won't get American visas. It took Abu years to get his, and your government's even more strict about letting young people into the country. Why? Zora hands me the bowl of nuts, but I wave it away. Because they think we won't leave. That we say we're coming for a visit, but it's a trick so we can stay forever. Zora grumbles and shakes her head. But not everyone wants to live in America. I know I don't. Zora's last few words cut through the warm night air. What's wrong with living in America? I like my life here, Zora continues. I want to be close to the family. I want to work for my country and do something to help people here. And I don't want to be in a place where I'm not wanted. Heat rises to my face as she utters the last sentence. She's talking about my country, the one that's a part of me and made me who I am. I stay silent and stare at the sky, trying to make out constellations as I think about how to respond. You're not wanted in America, I finally say in a small voice that sounds less confident than I want. I listen to the news, Amina, Zora scoffs. Remember what happened to your own mosque and the things those kids wrote on the walls? But stuff like that isn't happening all the time, I argue, even as the words go home flash through my mind. Zora doesn't respond, but I can sense her disbelief. Most Americans are nice and good, I continue. Everyone helped repair the mosque. My friend Sujin's church held our carnival and everything. They wouldn't have needed to if it wasn't destroyed in the first place. I gulp. That's true too. But I know Zora is wrong. I just don't know how to make her see it. My cousin is fierce and loving and loyal and generous, but when she speaks like I'm a silly kid and she's an authority, it's like we're back at the market. I'm supposed to stay quiet and not have opinions. You know, I was afraid to come here, I say after a moment. What? To Pakistan. I was afraid to come. You're only saying that now because of what I said. As she dismisses my thoughts, Zora turns her body so her back is toward me. It's a slight movement, but suddenly the distance between us is as wide as the ocean that usually separates us. No, it's true. I heard scary things about terrorism and explosions and stuff, and I was afraid something bad would happen to us while we were here. Zora snorts. The cat stirs, stretches, and then curls herself back into a ball. I'm just saying you can't always think everything is what you hear on the news, I continue, realizing Baba has said something similar to me a few months ago. When my father sensed I wasn't excited about visiting Pakistan, he urged me to talk about why. I finally confessed my fears to him one night, and he gave me a lecture about being rational and not letting my fears limit me. What are you supposed to believe then, Zora asks. Baba told me there's a lot behind headlines we read, and so much I don't know about this country. He pointed out that people mostly hear and remember bad news. It's true. I've never heard a news story about people in Pakistan sitting around drinking chai and making jokes. And I was surprised to see how happy the people who live in Pakistan are and how their lives are as full as mine. In some ways, with all the family around and the constant commotion, they might seem a little fuller. There's good and bad everywhere, I finally say. That's what Baba says. My Abu says that too, Zora agrees. I guess they are brothers. Our fathers live on different continents and only see each other every 4 years. But in some ways they are, after years. But in some ways they are strikingly similar, and in other ways, totally opposites, like Zora and me too. And it goes on from there. I'll pause. They start singing. Thank you.
So Louise, so we have some questions for you,
Sure.
if you don't mind. Louise, do you want to start us off? That's
Sure.
I love that scene on the roof. All of the scenes on the roof with her and her cousin are just so fantastic.
Thank you.
Just, you can smell them and feel the heat, just, and the laughter.
Thank you.
Thanks for sharing that, Hena. It's great to listen to you read it. It really brings the story to life. So that's a real treat for us.
Oh, thank you.
Well, let's go ahead and get started with some of these questions, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I wanted first to ask you about the phrase terabin. So Amina hears it in the Lahore marketplace, and her cousin Zahra explains it to her. So Hena, I'd like to ask, what does this phrase mean to you? And what does it mean to Amina?
So the phrase comes from, it's actually funny, when I wrote the book, I had the whole line from the song that it's a Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan song. And it says, terabin, it translates to without you, like my heart doesn't feel. It's a really bad translation, but roughly that's what it's saying. So terabin is sort of without you. And for Amina, she recognizes the voice in the market, but she doesn't understand the words because Urdu is not her first language. So she asks her cousin to explain it to her, and she does, and she's so moved by those words, and they just keep coming back to her later on through the story, especially as she returns to America and feels like a piece of her is sort of left, and having to leave her cousin. She doesn't feel the same, and her life doesn't feel the same without it. So that whole idea of, without you, without whatever you is, whether it's a special place, whether it's that special person, that sort of makes your heart feel incomplete somehow, or that there's, a hole there or a missing part, is really what I was thinking of, in terms of how do you keep that connection or fill that part of your heart, even through distance and whatever else is separating you.
And I feel like she has this incredible summer, and then she has to separate from her family in Pakistan. And then she comes home and she feels different. She feels like she's changed, but her longtime friends are not seeing that change in her. And I just wonder what it feels like, and talk about how Amina is sort of living between two cultures there, and what the strengths and challenges of living on both sides is.
Yeah, so I think, for so many kids who are straddling two cultures, or three even in some cases, that I think the strength is that I feel like you sort of develop stronger sense of empathy, for people who are maybe in a similar situation, who aren't fitting in exactly, who, sort of feel like an outsider. I think that most kids can relate to those experiences and get it very intuitively. I think they also, have a perspective, especially even without traveling to the home country, the fact that you have parents who maybe share those stories of what it's like, you have a sense of there being a bigger world outside of your community, your neighborhood, even the United States, and a sense of, the way people might live differently or have, different means or whatever it is, just a different life than what we're accustomed to. So I feel like there's a greater global perspective a lot of times while living between cultures and, having exposure to more perhaps different languages or, customs or whatever it is. So a lot of positives, but I think some of the challenges are, not feeling quite like you fit in either place. I remember feeling that very much where, I wanted to be like my other friends at school, and everyone wants to fit in, especially school age kids. And, but, I didn't feel like I really fit in. Like I knew I had different rules in some ways, or, different expectations on me by my parents. But at the same time, I didn't always feel like I fit in with other Pakistani American kids who were maybe more cultural than me, who were more fluent in the language than me. And certainly when I visited Pakistan, I didn't feel like I belonged there, similar to what Amina feels. And then of course, that's on a very internal level, but then there's the extra external pressure that you may feel as a kid who's coming from a culture that maybe is under attack, or viewed through a negative lens. And I think sadly a lot of American Muslim children are feeling that, where not only are you trying to reconcile how you fit in and what you feel about your own identity, but then on top of that having to digest and process some of the harsh, horrible, and untrue things that you're hearing about your people or people similar to you, is a real burden for kids, unfortunately, I think, to have to carry.
Yeah, great.
Oh,
thank you.
Not fitting in and having different expectations and having to juggle these two worlds. So I'm hearing the part about you feeling different or maybe feeling on the outside. Amina and Zahra, I want to return to that conversation for just a minute, because Zahra mentions this part about she doesn't want to go to where she's not wanted. And I'm wondering if you or Amina have ever felt not wanted, and then moving on from there, what you think might be able to be done in classrooms to counteract those feelings or feelings pushed on new Americans or recent arrivals of being unwanted.
So I think for me, Amina unfortunately does feel it. She hadn't felt it. I think I also didn't feel particularly unwanted, thankfully, as I was growing up. I think as we see things change, as I see, youth today having to grow up in a post 9/11 world, it's quite different than it was for me when I was growing up, when people really hadn't heard the word Muslim in many cases or didn't know where Pakistan was on a map, so I felt, if anything, a little bit invisible, and that people maybe weren't interested in my experiences when I was a child. And I think children today are facing very, very different challenges. And Amina experiences that, it's a sort of a big wake-up call when, the mosque vandalism that is referred to in the chapter I just read too, where, there is vandalism and graffiti that says things like "go home," and in Amina's voice, she struggles with that, where she's thinking, where am I supposed to go? This is my home, and all of a sudden the sense of being viewed as an outsider, as somebody who perhaps is unwanted by, obviously a small segment of the population, you hope, but still that feeling is very violating. And I think sadly, more and more children are feeling that and facing that. In terms of what can be done, I think, obviously, if we hear anything, I feel like there's been very, good and active campaigns to root out other types of hate speech. I do think when it comes to American Muslims, a lot of stuff is sort of slipping through, where, especially even as jokes that are made, where, references to bombs or references to, just ISIS or other terrible things. And I feel like this is a safe space so we can all say these things, but kids are getting away with saying that kind of stuff. And kids like mine even have had to sort of laugh it off, or, assume that the intent is not to harm, when in fact those things are harmful to hear, and no kid should have to. So I think at a very basic level, just being really vigilant about what's being said, but in general, at a more broader level, in terms of how to create like a welcoming environment and making people feel included, I think just, being curious. Amina feels this when she comes back, and she's so excited to share little details, and her friends are kind of like, oh, okay, well, you know what happened to me, and they're just sort of not giving her enough feedback or enough, we call it lift in the Desi, the South Asian community, where you're not getting enough encouragement to share. And so I think just taking the time to ask questions, to be curious and to be interested in someone's experience in a really genuine way goes such a long way to make people feel like you care and their experiences matter to you.
Thank you.
And I think I want to follow up a little bit on that too, because I'm thinking about, so as you mentioned, in Amina's Voice, there is a group of young men vandalized the Islamic Center, the mosque. And we see in this, I hope it's not a spoiler, we see those boys have come to trial in the sequel. And I was really struck, one of the young white boys said, that he was really sorry, and that he didn't know any Muslims, right? That he went in there, it was supposed to be a joke, it got out of hand, but he didn't know any Muslims. And I'm sort of asking myself, well, it's not the job of Muslim Americans to educate boys and men like this. How do you think that exposure to Muslim picture books, Muslim novels, sort of changes that experience? And can books be anti-racist tools?
I really hope so, and I do believe so, because we hear over and over again, and actually when I had the vandalism take place in Amina's Voice, I didn't say who did it, and in my mind when I wrote it, I thought it was going to remain faceless vandals. I didn't think about who it was. Only after talking to kids, they would ask me oftentimes who did it, that I realized that kids really wanted to know, and they wanted, they have such a strong sense of justice, they wanted to see. So that was the reason why I mentioned it in Amina's song, to give them that closure, but also because I had heard about real life situations. There was a mosque attack, I think it was in Toledo, Ohio, or somewhere in the Midwest, where that was one of the things that came up during it was a man's trial, where he mentioned not knowing any Muslim people personally, and about being riled up by the hateful things he was hearing in the media. And so, those are such powerful, that combination is so powerful, right? Not knowing someone personally and hearing, hateful rhetoric can rile people up. And I do hope and, believe that books and stories can be an antidote. I've actually had a story of a child who I met in Baltimore, Maryland, who told me during a presentation where the group had been reading Amina's Voice. They weren't quite done. They were halfway through. And he told me that, he said, I have a racist family, and I hear things like Islam hates America. And I'm just so glad that I can understand the truth. And, that was while reading the story. And I just feel like if you get to know, we know that it's hard to hate what you know. And if you get to know Muslim families through literature and see how much you actually have in common with them, and realize that, oh, what's going on at that mosque is actually the same stuff that happens at my church, pizza fundraisers and Sunday school and prayer and congregation and kids whining and complaining, it's all the same. Hopefully, that tolerance will grow, is my wish.
And I just want to, we're going to some of the, some of the issues within the book, but this book is filled with so much joy, right? I love this family. I love her friends. The trip I had to start the book all over again so I could go back to Lahore, go back to that piece. And yeah, there's so much here. I was just about to say, Pius, do you have any questions?
Oh, well, I just have, I will make a comment on making sure that books that reflect everyone, especially Muslims, are placed in classrooms and in libraries across the country. What that does is that it opens conversation. It brings those students, like the student that said to you that after he's read Amina, that my family is racist. I used to run a program called Maine Interfaith Youth Alliance. And basically what I do is every year in the spring around this time, I travel across Maine, going into classrooms and telling people, middle school and high school students, about my story, who I am as a Muslim and immigrant. And sometimes the conversation is interesting. They ask questions on what is Islam, who is a Muslim, and I talk to them. And I have been in spaces where other students who have never shared their identity will say that, by the way, I'm Jewish, and my family is the only Jewish in this community. I've never been able to feel comfortable coming out and say, this is who I am. But today, talking to you and hearing your story as a Muslim have given me the opportunity, or have given me the confidence to also share my story. So when you put books that talks about people who don't normally get that, how do we call it, exposure, it doesn't just help Muslims, it helps every other student who is in the classroom or in the school building. So that would just be, I am also interested in the drinking chai, and it seems like it is universal to some communities. In my village where my grandmother raised me, the men in the family, some of them are mu'allims, as we call them. There's a time of the day that they will sit down on their animal skin and fold their legs and drink tea or chai. And yeah, so when you were reading that, I'm smiling because it's a familiar. Yeah.
I love that.
I'd like to pause for just a minute. There's a question that I'm curious about too. Dorothy is asking, she said her daughter wants to know if Amina is a common name.
So it is. We often pronounce it in Pakistan, Amna. So sometimes we eat that I. I know in Arabic speaking communities, it's most often pronounced Amina. But in Pakistan, we both have Amina and Amna. And it's fairly common. I wouldn't say like super common, but it is.
It's interesting you talking about this now. I had a conversation before this happened with Kirsten. I said, gosh, Kirsten, I've been saying this wrong for the longest time. I've been telling my students and reading this as Amina, Amina. We speak Arabic in our home. And so Amina was very natural for me. And then I heard another interview that you'd given and you pronounced it Amina. I said, oh my God.
I know, and I do that to everyone. I feel really bad, but it is the way we pronounce it. And Pakistanis tend to pronounce Arabic names differently. Like we, instead of Zaid, we'll say Zad, or, you know, just instead of Zainab, we'll say Zanab. So we sort of make everything a little softer, the vowel sound. And so that's why I even thought, I was like, did I start saying Amina? Yeah, exactly.
And I have to give a shout out to a new picture book, if you haven't seen it, called Your Name is a Song, which is a beautiful book that follows a Black Muslim child after her first day of school. She leaves school, her mother meets her and asks how her day is, and she's like, I did not have a good day. And the mother finally unravels that her white teacher couldn't say her name. So as the mother and daughter walk through the city, her mother's telling her the meaning of her name and how beautiful it is, and teaches her. Together they compose a song about how to say her name and what her name sounds like. And not only does she go back the next day and teach the teacher and her fellow students her name, but then she proceeds to sing all the names of all the kids. So I really, maybe Stephanie will drop a link to that in the chat.
It's a beautiful book. I highly recommend it too.
Print just dropped one in there for us. So
Yeah.
There we go.
So moving on a little bit, I'd like to turn, if we can, to Thayajan, to the uncle in this story, right? And so where he came to in the first book, he was in the United States, and now Amina's on the other side of the world here with him. And at one point, this little piece in the book comes up, and I'll read it. But what I want to ask is that the uncle is suffering from heart problems. And so the father is kind of explaining how the heart can help heal itself. So here's what it says in the text. Afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about the idea of our hearts growing on their own, creating new vessels when they need to. I wonder if that's what happens when we open ourselves up to love new things. And if so, I know I grew a new vessel this summer for Pakistan and my cousins. So I'm wondering if you might have a take on this. Do you think that the reading or that literature can create new vessels?
Absolutely. I think to what we were talking about earlier, making those connections and sort of growing, I love the imagery of a heart sort of expanding. And really it is, in a way, maybe one heart to another even, growing that connection. And I feel like we do when we read. How can you not, especially reading about people who have fully realized nuanced characters, who have, rich lives, who aren't, to what you were saying earlier, Kristen, who aren't, not just stories about people who are victims, but people who are proud, unapologetically who they are, living their lives, experiencing different things, maybe trying to wrestle with some stuff that's going on around them, of course, but, being likable, relatable characters. I feel like you connect with those characters, you fall in love with them, and you can't help but, grow your heart a little bit to include them. And I know, just like I, felt like my heart grew to include Ramona Quimby and, Josephine March and all the characters I loved. I just hope that readers will read some of my characters and develop a spot for them. And so many other characters who, there's so much great literature out there for kids. We're seeing so many voices that I think need to be read. And I really do hope that everyone's vessels will develop, especially for each of them.
Louise, do you want to pop into your slides?
Sure, I'm happy to. Let's.
And I know that Stephanie has reminded us in the chat, but if you have questions, let's put them in the Q&A, because we'll have some time to ask some more questions in the end. And if you don't have any, I have lots.
Let's see if we can get all this business out of here. So we'll just take a couple minutes. I just wanted to speak to this, just being able to embed all of these rich, diverse materials into our classrooms, into our libraries. And so, Kristen, I want you also to jump in here as we move through. Just want to make sure I'm not on mute. Can you hear me okay? Perfect.
Yes.
This quote was shared with me, and it's one that I carry around with me frequently. It's one that I keep in my classroom. Think before you speak and read before you think. And just kind of settling down into this thought, and especially in these times, I think it's perhaps more important than ever before. So when I'm working with a classroom or a library or a team, the areas that we really focus on when we're talking about diverse literature are exposure and empathy and connection and action. So exposure, right, is that first part. And we've heard so much about this today. And this came up again, Hena, in your book about just not knowing a Muslim. And I don't want to give parts of the story away, but at one point when the group of boys were arrested, one of the comments the boys made were that I didn't really know what I was doing. I don't really have hatred. I don't know a Muslim. I don't have any experience with this. So that exposure, and you said this yourself too in different words, that we are designed to fear what we don't know. I think what you said is it's hard to hate what you do know. So just having that level of exposure, and I really appreciate your books in particular for providing that to our students. But then when we have that exposure, we can move more into empathy, and that's come up in our conversation a lot too. So that's helping us to break down the us versus them divide and lead us into connection. And that's where we start to have those authentic relationships. And then finally, we move into this last part, and Kirsten and I have been having some heart-to-heart talks about this week, that yes, in this connection piece, right, that literature and diverse literature in particular is really good about building up exposure and empathy and connection, but we're at a place and a time where we just can't stop there. There has to be a next step. And so we can move toward action, but we really have to lay that groundwork first. And what I find is that immigrant literature in particular really helps with those pieces, leading us into a place that we can become allies for our friends and neighbors who may be different than us. So I want to go back for a moment because we've talked about this name. We came up with Amina. This happens to be my son's name here, but when I'm working with groups of students or in professional development sessions, we start the year, we start the professional development session with a whole section on just understanding identity and a name and what's in a name. And from a trauma-informed perspective, the name is one of those tools that we use even to ground students when they're having an episode, because there's nothing as familiar and as true to a person generally as their own name. It's the one thing that stayed consistent for many of our students for their entire lives, right? So there's truth in that, and there's history and there's stories. So staying with this, what's in a name, when I start a unit that's introducing characters who have a different background, we always start with the name. And Islam in particular is powerful to me in that name piece because it comes from that salam, right? Which is peace in itself. And so when we start the learning, the lesson by rooting down into this idea of peace, and talking about that, and talking about maybe how that's juxtaposed to the media and other things that we hear. And when we find books or literature or humans that can give us a different experience and introduce us to really what Islam and what, by and large, all of the world's religions are, which is really just rooted into being a good human, right? So if we start there, and then we talk a little bit more about what it means to be a Muslim. And the points that I'd like to make here are that one, it's not a race. And this is one piece that we keep coming back to in our classrooms, even in our professional development settings. Again, we work with that identity. So we build out what is race, what is ethnicity. We move down into nationality and heritage and culture. And this is how we start to understand where culturally responsive teaching and learning occurs. But when we see it as not a race, the first thing that we introduce is that not all Muslims are Arab, that they can be Pakistani, or they can be Tanzanian, or they can be Burmese. Also, we have the idea that not all people with Arabic names are Muslim, right? So a lot of Christian Arabs, for example, have Arabic sounding names, but they can't necessarily be tied to that. And then finally, just understanding that Muslims are not a monolith. So Muslim women may choose to cover or to not cover, or the different little pieces of how that identity plays out in the day-to-day life can vary tremendously. There's a story that I want to share. This is from a blog that I follow regularly. It's called Teaching While Muslim. And so Jaria is the one who wrote this particular passage. And she brought this book into her classroom, and she was so excited about it. It was brand new, and she puts it on her bookshelf, and her students bring it up to her and they say, "Wow, Mrs. Muhammad, this is you. This is so cool. You wrote a book. I didn't know you were an author. This is awesome." And she kind of smiled, and then she realized they were being serious about this. But she told them that she wasn't the author, and they were really disappointed about it. But what that made her realize was that these students just didn't have exposure to another woman who was also covered. So when they saw this upper half of the face of a woman who was covered, they automatically assumed that it was her, that she was the author. And that was a real eye-opener for her, in the sense that she would not only needed to portray diverse books, but that she needed to have a whole array of different types of literature representing even that one area. And this holds true for whatever area of diversity we're highlighting, right? But I like this idea that she was searching for this perfect book that showcased all Muslim women in one way, and that's just simply not realistic. And one thing that I love about your text, Hena, is that there's a lot of variety in the way that people are living their lives that isn't, it doesn't follow all of the constructs necessarily that we might have in our head, what things should look like. A few classroom tools. If you're not familiar with Hena's website, Hena, correct me if I'm wrong, but I have utilized lesson plans directly from your website. So if you go in and click on a book, there are educators' guides for almost every book. So those walk you through examples for in-class activities and vocabulary and all sorts of things there. So Hena, maybe would like to ask you to follow up on this and clarify for me as we finish up here. There are a few others I'd love to point out here. These are some great resources, but also the blogs are really informative. The social justice books has an evaluation criteria that they use to choose diverse books that I found really helpful in the classroom and in library settings. So that may also be something that you're interested in. These resources, Kirsten, are also available on the website as additional tools, right?
Yes, so if you pop over to I'm Your Neighbor Books, we've created a blog post that has all the links from the evening. So don't need to grab them.
Fabulous. And I just wanted to finish up here. We talked about kind of bringing together through this. And this is one of those terms that we may hear or come across in reading or with our students, depending on where you're from. It's either inshallah or inshallah. And yarab is kind of the extra emphasis that we sometimes put on it, inshallah yarab. And this is, again, that idea of a peace or kind of a loose promise, a hope. And this is actually even carried over into Spanish from the time of the Moors. So there's it's a word that's very close in Spanish now that means exactly the same thing. But we use this frequently. It's all over. But what I just want to kind of ground down into this idea of it being this, an idea of promise and hope and coming together. So today I would just like to make a statement that through literature will enable children to be seen and to see others as their authentic selves, inshallah. And I will hand it back over to you, Kirsten.
Great. Any follow-up pass before I get started?
In the inshallah Rab is an interesting phrase that we all use. One day my daughter, she lived with her mom. She asked for something and I said, inshallah, we'll do it. And then she yelled, she was a little than to her mom. She said, Dad said, inshallah. And I didn't understand what that meant. When I had her over the weekend, I said, what was that about? And she said, yeah, all the Arab kids in my class said that if their parents say, inshallah, that means it's not going to happen.
Coming from your parent, it's probably not going to happen.
Yeah, so she said, when you said, inshallah, apparently she went home and told her mom that there is some phrase that Dad used to say. She didn't remember. So she said to her mom, when he said, I remind you, that means he's not going to get whatever I asked him. So when I said, inshallah, she yelled. I could hear it on the phone. Oh, no. He said, inshallah.
So of course, the direct translation is God willing, or if God wills it to be so. And you're exactly right. If it's coming from a parent, good luck.
Hena, did you hear it from your parents?
Yes, and I use it too as a parent.
No, I'm not gonna feel back. And yeah, thank you very much for doing this, Hena. It helped make the work much easier for all of us.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And that was a lovely presentation, Louise. I really enjoyed it.
to take just a few minutes to run through the resources that are available at I'm Your Neighbor Books. Some of them which are quite new. I wanted to start with the, just going back in time a little bit. I'm Your Neighbor Books is a project that Pius and I, a group of amazing authors and librarians, formed back in 2012. And, you know, as community members in a refugee resettlement city that sits within the whitest state in the nation, we have just always turned to books to have these crucial cross-cultural conversations. But sort of, you know, looking back to that time, Pius and I both moved to Maine just after 9/11, and we were both doing cross-cultural work. Pius was doing cross-faith work. I was doing work with books in schools. And the crazy thing is there were no books set in the Muslim community at that time. Okay, and so we're flashing forward. It took us a long time, but we're flashing forward to a time when Simon & Schuster has an all Muslim imprint, right? And that we went from 0 books set, almost no books set in the new arrival community, to now I'm Your Neighbor Books maintains a database of over 500 titles that are set in cultures across the United States. And so I'm just going to give you a quick walk through that. On the site, you can look, you can browse through collections based on community. So from Afghan Americans to Zimbabwean Americans, you can navigate through. Here's the beginning of our Pakistani American, which is 29, 30 titles and growing. So you'll see titles that are set in the community here. Occasionally a book like Amal Unbound that is set in Pakistan, if we feel it sort of informs our knowledge of the community here in the States, we include it. And titles, there's that Does My Head Look Big in This? There's a really strong supporting character who's from Pakistan in that title. So you'll see those breakdowns, features on each one of the books, and we curate when we can the collection of materials that are related to the title and help you engage. You can also, there are over 81 cross-cultural themes. For example, we say AMINA'S Song has cross-group friendship, and you can see titles set in communities across the world here. Family separated because of different immigration statuses, religious background, Muslim, and we've attached a long list to Hena's books, so you can build conversations across communities. We also create community guides ourselves. This is the first thing that Louise and I did together. We created a, I think it clocks in at about 37-page guide to being an ally to Muslim immigrant students based on the novel Nowhere Boy. We wrote it, I would get up at 4 o'clock in the morning here in Maine as Louise was watching the sun go down in Lebanon, and my sun would rise as hers sank. It was an incredible way to collaborate. And just to note that we are constantly building titles.
We left that book in the hands of Syrian refugees inside of Lebanon. Nice.
If you don't know it, it is an incredibly powerful book. And just to note that my team is always happy to make selection lists for you that reflect your community and reflect your budgets. And this is a big thank you to Hena, because I believe Golden Domes came out in 2012. And it became the impetus for a program that is really core to us called the Welcoming Library. Kate Cutco, who's on this call, and it references back to my very first event at Print. I did an event at Print during the Muslim ban. We had done it intentionally during that time. And Kate Cutco came up to me and said, it's all well and good that we're talking about this books, but we have to do more. And this was the have to do more. The Welcoming Library is in these two crates that we are all overly fond of that roll into schools and libraries in 7 different states. And once you get them inside and pop them open, one has a collection of 30 picture books set in communities across the country. And the other one has this bizarre little tinker toy collection of wooden blocks and dowels that come together to make a book display, so that when these books arrive, and they arrive for a 4-week loan at schools and libraries and community centers, they pop up into a display that's topped with I'm Your Neighbor in 10 different languages. And because there are 30 books and we are asking people, librarians, teachers, parents, community members to read aloud and talk about books that may be out of their experiences, each book has a unique set of discussion questions in the back. And you see that subtitle there, Exploring the Story in Your Own. It really asks you to look back at the pages and find your own personal connections to the story. This collection of books has been, and a big shout out to Hena and all of these authors. These new titles have been really transformative to how we teach immigration. In school after school, teachers are making the decision to leave Ellis Island as a historical conversation and to redo their immigration unit based on these 30 titles, including Golden Domes and Silver Lanterns. And new arrival and new American kids are sometimes seeing themselves for the first time in these pages. As educators, librarians, caring community members, we know how powerful and crucial that sense of belonging is. And it's really also having a powerful, that deep diversity of community that's represented in that collection is giving long-term kids a real sense of what it is to be American. Ann Sibley O'Brien and I spotted, this was at the Muslim ban rally, the anti-Muslim ban rally in Portland in 2017, which is just the most brilliant thing I've ever seen. So I just want to say, please come in and knock on our door and use all of those free materials. If you're lucky enough to be in one of the 7 states, you can borrow Welcoming Library. If you're not in those 7 states, call me. We'll write a grant together. We just hope that you come in, throw down your email, because we announce new projects all the time, hoping to release something really amazing on Friday. We're giving away books, we're giving away tools, and just trying to bring the conversation about new arrivals and new Americans into our classrooms. And again, a big thank you to Kimberly Moran, who has, because of her, 50 of you are going to have AMINA'S Song on your shelves. So I would love, if anybody has any follow-up to that, and we can move into some questions from the fabulous people that are still with us. Do we have, you can drop in the, there you are, Stephanie.
Hi.
Hello.
Sometimes it takes a little bit to click the buttons. Yeah, as I had mentioned before, we have the Q&A function available at the bottom of your screen. You can submit your questions there. Please do. We love to hear from the audience. I mean, I guess I'm kind of curious myself, Hena, if you could speak a little bit about just, you know, your journey of creating these books and now seeing these welcoming libraries. Can you talk a little bit more about what that's like and what your hopes are for continuing to build this community of inclusive literature?
Sure. Yeah. And I love something that you said, Louise, when you were sharing the story about Does My Head Look Big in This, which is a book that I really enjoyed. But, you know, the teacher feeling like, you know, she had to find the perfect book to represent everyone. And I think I just actually wrote a blog post for We Need Diverse Books that went up a few days ago, where I talked about what it felt like as one of the first American Muslims publishing for like mainstream, you know, with mainstream publishers and for, you know, broad audience. I put that pressure on myself, which made no sense because of course I can't represent 2 billion Muslims, but I really felt like I had to create the perfect books that, you know, included everyone, where everyone would see themselves and nobody would take offense to anything I chose to include. And of course I can't do that. And so it's amazing to just see the transformation over, you know, the last decade, especially, but even the last 5 years, to see more and more stories like the ones included in your traveling library, which is amazing and just so reassuring and comforting, because I don't feel alone anymore. And I don't feel like, you know, I see, you know, even My Name Is a Song and other beautiful books that are being added to the, you know, the literature that we just need so many more. And for someone who's interested in diverse books and pays attention, it feels like, you know, there's so many coming out and each time it's like a celebration, but it actually, you know, within, you know, the bigger picture and all the, it's still just a, you know, a start, and we just need so many more, but I am encouraged and I love what you're doing. And I, you know, I'm proud to be a part of it. I think it's so important.
And I think that comment to that idea of people feeling that pressure to, oh, this has to be the perfect representation of something is also so complicated, because when there's only so many books showing these types of characters, people from these backgrounds, it feels like they can't be full people. It feels like they can't have flaws. It feels like they can't be mean sometimes. And that's not true either. Like, nobody only wants to see an idealized version of themselves. Like, people want to see relatable characters. And it feels like we're finally getting to the point where, as you said, we still have a lot to go in terms of having more inclusive books, but we're starting to reach a point where they can be real fleshed out characters and don't just have to be this good, perfect person.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And I thought about it more with my picture books, you know, since I started with Net of the Moon, which came out in 2008. And because it was depicting Ramadan, but Ramadan from the perspective of a Pakistani American family, I was thinking, you know, what if other families don't have the same traditions? And, you know, I mentioned henna, not every Muslim community, you know, puts henna on their hands. And what if they, you know, and so, but going from that to, yeah, having characters and thinking about, you know, my deciding to include music as a theme in AMINA'S Voice, which, you know, is to what you were saying, Louise, not all, you know, Muslims are a monolith, or we have very different ways of practicing and approaching our faith. And for some people that's, you know, welcome, and for some people it's not. But I wanted to introduce that notion in the book too, that we all do practice in different ways.
You know what? It makes me, it makes me think about that a book that I have here on our shelf. This book has been out for quite a few years. My friend Jamal and Pius and I actually dealt with a challenge with it, because it's done in photographs, and there's actually a photograph of an open Quran, and one of the imams in our neighborhood said, you know, I don't like that. Like, this is a sacred text and a photograph of it degrades it. And then, you know, we had this amazing experience with this book. There was a teacher that was reading it in a summer school, and she got to this page, and and there was a boy in the back row, and he raised his hand, and she said he hadn't spoken to any of the other students all summer long. He hadn't spoken in class. And she's like, I'm going to call on him because he hasn't said a word. And he said to her, you haven't read the whole page. And she's like looking, and she's like, I read the whole page. And he got up and he came up and he politely asked for the book. And then he proceeded to read this page from the Quran. And in fact, like, it runs off the page, and he was able to finish the passage, right? And there was 2 other Muslim kids in the class who were just like, they understood that this, as a 3rd grader, this was like scholar level, and they started to clap. And by then all the kids got on their feet and were cheering this kid, and the teacher had no, and I think that's sort of the point I'm trying to get around to, was that the teacher had been really hesitant to use this book because she had no experience with the community, right? But her kids did. Like, and her kids filled in where the story filled in where she didn't have the experience, and the kids in her classroom filled in where the experience wasn't there. And it was a transformative moment for that classroom and for that child. So if anybody's brave enough to, I know we're getting close to the end, but I realized that, there are, some people can feel barriers to sharing these titles in the classroom. And I think to be honest about those and ask your fellow educators for help, ask brilliant people like consultants like Louise for help. Like, how do you get over some of those hesitations?
Well, it looks like everyone did such an amazing job with the presentations that we don't have any audience questions right now, but I was hoping before we sign off this evening, if each of you could talk a little bit about what your next project is. What ways are you engaging with the communities? What books are you writing? And just give us a little sense of what comes next. And also let everybody know the best way to keep on top of what you're doing, to follow up, to ask questions if they come up later. Kirsten, if you want to start.
Oh, there's so many ways to answer that. I'm really incredibly grateful to my board and all of our donors, because I've gone from about 4 or 5 hours a week to about 2/3 time now working on this. So I feel like there is nothing but news coming ahead because we have the time to do things. Probably my biggest personal joy is we're launching a welcoming library in my home state of Vermont in memory of my dad. And because I'm getting vaccinated next week, I'm going to be able to live cast that launch from my elementary school library, where my dad was a volunteer. So that's my happy next.
That's lovely.
Louise?
Sure. I just submitted my last, I hope, draft to my publisher for the next book, which is fantastic. But after this, Hena, I think I'm switching over. No more nonfiction. I gotta go the other way. This one is on trauma and recent arrival populations. So mitigating trauma in the classroom, but looking specifically at recent arrivals and diverse populations. And so that has a whole world of professional development linked to it, but it's timely and it's something that's really close to my heart, and I'm super excited for the opportunity to do it. But I'm coming to you for advice next, Hena, because I'm
Yes, we do. Yes, we all need to share our stories. That sounds fantastic. I'm continuing to write. I have a few projects in the works. I actually have a book coming out in May, which is book 6 of the Unicorn Rescue Society that I co-authored with Adam Gidwitz, and it actually takes place partly in the Himalayan mountains of Pakistan, and it's kind of a nice representation of Islam in there, which I'm really proud of. I'm writing a companion series to Zaid Salim Chasing the Dream, featuring his sister Zara, a Choose Your Path branching series, and which is very different. It's a superhero, superpower based, a big departure from what my other books, and some other picture books and just more good stuff on the way, hopefully. So if you want to stay connected and hear about my books as they come out, you can visit my website. I'm not great at updating my website that frequently, so if you're on social media, it's at Hena Kahn Books. I'm on Instagram the most, Twitter some, Facebook not as much, but and then of course henakahn.com, you can get in touch with me directly.
And Pius, do you want to say anything about schools before we slip out?
Not exactly our schools, but still I want to share my appreciation for both Hena and Louise, and also for Stephanie for putting this together, and for everyone who, from librarians to board members and everyone who have joined us this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you everyone for being a part of this. I just wanted to give a final reminder to our audience members. You can place your orders for AMINA'S song on our website. We have some signed book plates as well. And also a reminder that if you are an educator, if you mention in your order comments during the checkout, you can get a 20% discount for classroom use. So I hope everyone takes advantage of that and brings these amazing books into your library and school collections. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. It was so wonderful spending time with all of you. Thank you for inviting me.
Hena, thanks for all you do.
Likewise.